Welcome to section 2, where we are now going to talk about arguments against in-house production. What are some of the downsides of doing manufacturing ourselves? Let's begin by talking about the ongoing financing and expense of fixed assets, the need to have and own and operate plant and equipment, the factory buildings, and the manufacturing equipment that goes into it. It's very expensive. It diverts funds away from other areas that we could invest in. And from an accounting perspective, we always have to be paying attention to the depreciation of our plant and equipment. Second bullet, because we are the producer, we also have to make heavy investments in inventories. We're the manufacturer, so we need to acquire and pay for raw materials, sub-assemblies, all of the different types of materials that go into a production environment. But also, when we're producing but haven't finished yet, we're dealing with work in process. There's a value to that. The finished goods that we're actually making, as we've discussed previously, we have to have inventory in the form of parts that can keep our equipment running. And then MRO, maintenance, repair, and operations inventory, which we also defined in prior sections and modules. All of the materials that we need to maintain, repair, and operate our equipment. Cleaning solvents, repair equipment, things of that nature. There's a lot of money that must be invested in inventories that we will carry on our balance sheet in the form of current assets. You will recall previous sections where we saw the seesaw of the balance that needs to be created between sales being generated and investments being made in inventory. This is what we're talking about here. Last bullet on this slide, we also have the burden of fixed costs. We have expenses that are going to need to be paid every month, whether we produce one item or 1,000,000 items. We have to run the factory. We have to pay the lease on the building, the insurance on the building. We have to have a certain number of employees around, whether we make anything or not. Those are fixed costs. When we talk about outsourced production, those fixed costs go away and they become variable. More on that in the upcoming module. Moving on, what are some of the other arguments against in-house production? We're always going to need economies of scale, meaning that our production equipment is running all the time to get the most out of our investment in that production equipment. What are expressed as large production runs. Run a machine all day making the same thing. Economies of scale, because the more we produce, the more units we produce, the more we can spread our fixed costs across that number of units. Manufacturing people are all about economies of scale. Second point, and one can suppose that this is a good problem to have, production constraints. We have more demand for our products than we have production capacity. But it's a real consideration when we are running our own manufacturing and we only have a certain amount of equipment, a certain amount of people. We can only make a certain amount of stuff. Unfortunately, in our third bullet point, typically, not always, in the United States, labor costs are higher than other traditional outsourced countries. China comes to mind immediately. Taiwan, emerging economies like Vietnam, Cambodia, Myanmar. The unfortunate reality is that labor costs in the United States, fully loaded with taxes and insurance and such, they're just higher. Fourth bullet, sometimes manufacturing companies have a corporate culture that understandably is driven by manufacturing and economies of scale mentality without as much balance on the side of customer focus. Doesn't happen always in a manufacturing environment, but the potential is certainly there. We are a manufacturing company. We make goods. That is our culture. We're all about driving down cost, increasing economies of scale, making the most of our production equipment. That's all great, but when that corporate culture overtakes a customer focus, some problems can ensue. These are legitimate arguments against in-house production. Now, we're going to switch over and talk about arguments in favor of outsourcing. Remember, we're looking at pros and cons right now. We're going to come back to a U.S. manufacturing model where the company makes their own merchandise based on imported raw materials. Right now, we're doing a little comparison work. One of the biggest arguments in favor of outsourcing is that it allows companies to focus on customer-centric core competencies. The term core competency has certainly become a cliche, but like most cliches, it's based on some real truths. When a company outsources its manufacturing, it permits that company to focus on what it does best. Product concept, research and development, product design, engineering, features of the product, sales and marketing, core competencies that companies focus on. To summarize, sub-bullet point, again, that product development piece, customer experience, we didn't mention, and sales and marketing. Third bullet, we talked a little bit about this in previous slides. From a financial perspective, there's no need for factories, plant, or equipment. We as a company do not need to invest money in factories, plant, or equipment because we're outsourcing all that to an overseas vendor, a contract manufacturer, third-party manufacturer, pretty much synonymous terms. So all of that money, the value of which would appear on our balance sheet in the form of fixed assets, can be invested somewhere else in those core competencies that we spoke of a moment ago. Part and parcel of not needing factories, plant, or equipment, it reduces our fixed costs. We don't have to pay the lease on the production building no matter what every month. We don't have to pay 100 employees in a manufacturing environment no matter what, whether we make 1 unit or 1 million units. Outsourcing reduces fixed costs, turns the cost environment into a variable cost, meaning that we as the importer who is buying product overseas, we're only paying for what we buy. We buy 10 units, we pay for 10 units. We buy 1 million units, we pay for 1 million units. There are no fixed costs associated with that. It's a variable cost. More arguments in favor of outsourcing? To summarize what we said in the previous slide, we are in a variable production environment as the company outsourcing our production. The actual production, what we pay for, is based on demand. We place a purchase order for 10,000 pairs of shoes on a vendor in Vietnam. That's what we're going to pay for. And the price is per unit produced. Consequently, second bullet, we're going to have a lower investment in inventory. By definition, when we're outsourcing, we're only dealing with finished goods, what is sometimes referred to as a buy one, sell one environment. We don't have investments in raw materials. We certainly don't have work in process laying around. We're dealing strictly with finished goods. And going back to our earlier history lesson about the evolution of outsourcing, it was all about access to cheap labor. Simple historical fact. That environment has changed a little bit on a country-specific basis. It's more expensive to produce in Mexico now. It's more expensive to produce in China. But there are plenty of countries around the world, Southeast Asia, Africa, Latin America, that still have very low labor rates. Let's be objective and talk about some of the arguments against outsourcing. The biggest and most legitimate argument against outsourcing is that it creates a loss of U.S. jobs. We all know the stories of how manufacturing jobs have been exported. That is true. It is a reality. It has to be mentioned here. Second bullet, more on a functional level and execution level, is the decoupling of demand from supply functions. We spoke earlier of the control we would have if we did our own manufacturing. From the sell side, dealing with forecasts and customer demand signals, into a buy side of acquiring raw materials and producing. There is a divide there. We've spoke of this previously. It's just a reality. Doesn't mean it can't be managed. It does mean it's a different dynamic. That is a very important consideration, how we manage relationships with our overseas manufacturers. One of the biggest concerns around outsourcing is the loss of control over manufacturing quality. We are relying on our overseas vendor, our overseas manufacturer, to create the level of quality that we agreed to in our service level agreement, our SLA. By definition, by very nature, there's a loss of control over that quality because we're not doing it ourselves. The quality of raw materials that our overseas manufacturer acquires, and sometimes that overseas manufacturer And sometimes, without us even knowing it, they're using subcontractors, which creates even more distance between ourselves and manufacturing quality. That is a real concern. The other point, looking at things from a technological perspective, there are more players in our supply chain, so there's going to be more software systems. Maybe a vendor has an ERP as we defined it previously. Oftentimes they do not. They use standalone software for purchasing, for manufacturing, for customer relationship management. The point here is the more players there are, and by definition there are more in an outsourced environment, the more software systems we're dealing with, and greater the challenge of linking our software together to create visibility across the supply chain. It's just harder to do. Some more arguments against outsourcing. Extended cumulative lead times. Depending on the production planning of our overseas manufacturers, the production runs could be longer, especially if those vendors, those offshore manufacturers, are dealing with other customers and they're prioritizing their production runs, and we find ourselves at the back of the line. That's going to extend our lead time. We have the international transportation component, which is longer, and U.S. Customs clearance. Depending on the technological capabilities of the companies we work with overseas, the possibility of a lack of visibility into the inbound supply chain is real. That's from a technological perspective. But because there are more players out in the physical world, there are going to be multiple handoffs of goods, of information, of documents along the way, which can also detract from visibility. Last point on this slide, the inability to engage in dynamic inventory management. We had defined dynamic inventory management as the allocation of goods on the fly as goods are moving. If we don't have as much visibility, the allocation of products on the fly becomes more difficult. And in today's world, the ability to allocate goods based not only on forecast, but actual demand signals is really important. It can be done in an outsourced environment, it's just more complicated. This is the last slide in section 2, so let's wrap up these arguments against outsourcing. First bullet, we've talked a lot about landed cost and what that means. We won't define it again here. What we're talking about is landed cost versus total cost of ownership, TCO, as it is sometimes called. We may calculate the landed cost of an outsourced product. Let's use that example of footwear coming out of Vietnam to illustrate. We have calculated our landed cost for a pair of shoes at $12. That's the calculation we came up with. However, what's the total cost of ownership? The value of time spent working with that vendor overseas. The value of travel for our engineers to go to Vietnam to set up dies. All of the communication that goes on. It's hard to calculate, but a consideration for total cost of ownership versus landed cost, pretty important. And depending on the nature of the relationship with an overseas manufacturer, in some instances, total cost of ownership can far exceed what that landed cost is. Let's wrap up with a programming note here. Whereas the balance of this module does focus on demand management for in-house manufacturing with imported raw materials, upcoming modules from the Master Import Specialist program contain examples from a variety of different business models: wholesaler, retailer, e-commerce, on and on. We're going to focus on in-house manufacturing in the U.S. based on the importation of raw materials. Come back soon.